Hello, I'm Mario Toneguzzi, and I'm taking care of business. Joining me today is Ben Eisen, who is a senior fellow with the Fraser Institute and co-author of a new report out today, 4 myths about economic diversification in Alberta. Ben, tell me what that report signified and said to you overall.
Well, it said a number of things to us overall, and we can get to it point by point as we go. But to begin with, I'd say that what really emerged from our research is that there's an awful lot of talk about economic diversification in Alberta. It comes up all the time. It's evergreen. It seems across parties. It's not just that one party talks about it.
Yeah.
But when you dig into the arguments surrounding it, there's often a lot of myths and misunderstanding, some unclear thinking about the economics of the situation, and some very unclear thinking about the actual nature of Alberta's economy as it exists today, as actually a modern diversified economy, which we can discuss it a little bit later. So what we tried to do in this is we tried to go point by point and better understand and try and contribute to the discussion, because it's not that we shouldn't have a discussion about diversification or concentration. We should, or specialization, however you want to look at it, but it should be informed by facts and data rather than myths. And as we dug in, we found that there was an awful lot of misperceptions and myths that seem to be driving this debate and maybe making it less productive than it should be.
All right, let's look at those 4 different myths. Number one, and this is probably a big one, especially for Alberta, excuse me, that Alberta is a petro state. Why is that a myth?
Well, we dug through it and we found a lot of people saying so. We didn't have trouble finding references of people referring to Alberta as a petrostate, sort of like Kuwait, or you can name any other number of places that are essentially driven by an oil, other commodities that are similar. But Alberta is nothing like that. We looked comparing nationally. How does Canada rank compared to other countries in terms of its level of economic diversification? We found Canada is, relatively speaking, a very diversified economy compared to a lot of our peers, much more diversified than the United States, in fact, and a lot of other countries were sort of, very diversified economy. And then when we looked at the provincial level, Alberta is really no different. It depends on the year you look at, and because they're so closely grouped together, the provinces move up and down the league table in terms of exactly where you rank. But when we looked at the data, we found really the larger provinces in Canada, including Alberta, are very close to one another in terms of how diversified they really are. The one outlier is Newfoundland and Labrador, which is heavily concentrated in the oil and gas sector in a very different way. But Alberta, you find it is a diversified modern economy with many sectors. Oil and gas is important to Alberta. I'm not going to dispute that for a moment. It's very important. But Alberta is a diversified economy and not in any way sort of simply reliant on the extraction of oil and natural gas as the only driver of economic productivity.
Yeah. Second myth we're talking about is economic diversification is necessary for stable public finances. Talk a little bit about that, Ben, and why is that a myth?
Well, this is even more wrong. A lot of governments, a lot of the time we talk about the fact that the provincial government is heavily reliant on natural resource revenue to fund their activities. That's not the fault of natural resources. That's not the fault of a robust natural resource sector. That's the fault of government spending decisions. That's the fault of governments mismanaging public finances. The reality is that it's entirely possible in a prosperous jurisdiction like Alberta to rely on more stable sources of revenue that are not sort of getting rid of a non-renewable resource to line up spending with taxes. These are things that can be done. The government simply chooses to fund government activities through natural resource revenues. So natural resource revenues should be a blessing to public finances. We should be capable of, especially in a rich place, again, like Alberta, able to align tax revenue with spending and then sock away revenue from natural resources to create a stream of income that we can use to be pro-growth, to keep lower taxes in the future. These are the things that we could do. The revenue itself, the natural resources aren't the problem. They're a blessing. The problem is the mismanagement of those resources. So when people say natural resource revenues are a problem for Alberta in terms of public finances, it's the opposite. It's a blessing. It's a blessing that we've squandered many times, but to look at it as somehow negative that all this additional money is flowing in, it's just it's a very backwards way to look at it. It's a good thing, not a bad thing. We just need to manage it better.
All right. Myth number 3. Top-down economic diversification efforts are evidently effective. What do you mean by that?
Well, government after government pursues economic diversification. They make noise about it. They say they're going to do it, and then they initiate these programs. And some of them have had some success, but for the most part, they don't. And what they look like usually is the government identifying some sector that's experiencing some growth that they think has some promise and putting some subsidies in it, trying to say, okay, this is the sector of the future. We're going to invest in this, and boy, it'll be great. This sector will grow. But the problem with that is that governments do not have a very good track record. Governments are not good at allocating capital. Governments are good at some things. Governments are good at lots of things, but markets are good at some things, and markets are good at lots of things. And one thing markets are better at is allocating capital, allocating resources, and allocating human capital in the form of employment, in places where they're going to drive the most growth. So when governments sort of in a top-down manner say, we've got the three sectors, we're going to put money into them, and that's going to diversify the economy. No, this is not the way to do it. You don't intentionally try to diversify the economy in that way. What you do is you create a pro-growth environment, you create a competitive tax and regulatory regime, and then you let the chips fall where they fall in terms of which sectors grow and which ones don't, rather than thinking that you as a government can pick and choose and know what the future of Alberta's economy look like. None of us know, and if we did, we could make an awful lot of money betting on it. So It's better for governments not to pretend they can read the future and rather just create a positive environment for growth, for business, and then let the chips fall where they fall in terms of sectoral growth.
True, yeah. The fourth myth is diversification is inherently good. Why is that a myth?
Well, this takes us back to sort of our first year of econ, which amazingly we can forget the lessons that our first year econ teachers taught us, but we should once in a while return to them. The opposite way of thinking, sometimes you look at both sides of the coin. The opposite of thinking in terms of diversification is thinking in terms of specialization. Economy, one of the first things we learn in macro and international trade is that a huge driver of prosperity is specialization. That jurisdictions should do the things where they have the biggest comparative advantage. They should, and then trade with the other jurisdictions that have a comparative advantage in everything else. The notion that every jurisdiction should do everything is completely backwards and completely disconnected from economic reality. For decades now, Alberta has had not just a comparative, but an absolute, that means better than almost anyone else, advantage in oil and gas. So it has made perfect sense for the economy to have, and again, without government direction, to have money and employment flowing into those sectors so that we can then trade with other jurisdictions and everyone gets wealthier as a result. This happens in textbooks and it happens in real life. And that's why, despite some difficult recent periods, the simple fact remains that Alberta is one of the richest jurisdictions in the world, with one of the highest standards of living in the world. And for us to think that we would have been doing better off all along if we had constrained this area where we have the comparative and absolute advantage that has driven prosperity and growth, that'd be a mistake. We don't know what the future holds, but we can look at the past and say specialization in oil and gas, to the extent it's happened, has been a major driver of prosperity in Alberta. Again, future, we'll see, but to view it as a mistake that Alberta has become one of the richest jurisdictions in the world as a result of oil and gas being a major driver of the economy, again, not the only one, but a major one, that seems like a funny way of thinking. We should think about specialization, which Alberta has done well, rather than thinking of diversification, which is not inherently good. Specialization and gains from trade are one of the biggest drivers of prosperity in the entire world.
All right, super. Thanks, Ben, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, super. That was Ben Eisen, who is Senior Fellow with the Fraser Institute and co-author of a new report called 4 Myths About Economic Diversification in Alberta. I'm Mario Toneguzzi. This has been Taking Care of Business. Thanks for joining us today.